So I'm just going to run through hopefully quite a brief presentation. It sort of looks at why vacant premises are a problem for local authorities and obviously communities. It looks a little bit at some of the benefits of sort of trying to reduce vacancies in a certain area, as well as some of the challenges from a local authority perspective. It considers why this current timing in the context of sort of a COVID recovery might be quite pertinent to sort of some of this stuff. And it also looks at or tries to sort of examine some mechanisms that communities or the local council, being Lambeth, might consider in sort of bringing regeneration back to Norwood High Street. And just for the purpose of this, we're going to be very much focused on a specific bit of West Norwood, but that will come a bit more clear as we go on. So I just wanted to bring this up first. This is from the Greater London Authority, from a document called High Streets for All. And I thought it was a really nice way to sort of map out what high streets deliver for communities and all the different ranges of activities that are delivered along a high street, how these can be very variable within different high streets, but how ultimately important high streets are to modern contemporary life in an urban context. And in a rural context, to be honest, as well. But I thought it was a nice way to start. So, just minimize this, sorry. So I just wanted to sort of roughly map out the problem, as it was. So it's really not news that the high street and retail has been struggling. Probably principally related to the growth in online shopping, but also changes in consumer taste. Potentially more people being conscious about the environment in terms of their consumer activities, and also out of town. Perhaps less so now, but certainly in previous years, out of town big retail units have all played their part. And if we have a look at sort of vacancy rates for high streets, they've been slowly creeping up over the last 10, 15 years. And currently nationally, they stand at 12.3% of all units within England are vacant, which is actually quite a high percentage. You know, it's above 1 in 10 if you're sort of thinking about that. And obviously that is very varied. So in certain regions, that's a lot higher. And London actually performs quite well, but obviously even within London, there's a big disparity. Currently, we see that if we split it between retail functions, so that's just sort of, you know, basic shops of various kinds, versus sort of leisure functions. So that might be, you know, anything from, you know, sort of leisure services or, you know, anything really. There's a difference there as well, which is quite enlightening. So that's 13.3% for retail and 9.4% for leisure, which does, I think, give some insights into how we might reform our high streets to be a bit more resilient. As I said, London generally performing better than other parts of the countries, but big disparities within the city. Ultimately, high streets are very important places because they contribute to social cohesion, community development, and strong local economic resilience. The opposite is, of course, true for those that are deteriorating. Okay, so it's obviously a sort of vice versa sort of situation. Within Lambeth, there is a clear appreciation of the need for affordable workspace, particularly within the inner London, to maintain and revive the high street. I think that's an appreciation from this local authority, among the GLA and nearly all councils, that without some attention to how high rents are, it's going to be very difficult to revive our high streets again. And this is a bit of data I found quite interesting. In London, there are over 22,000 commercial units that have been vacant for more than 6 months, and about 11,000 of those have been vacant for 2 years. By the time it's got to 2 years, that's gonna cause real blight within a high street. Those are going to be hard to let places, even if there is the demand, and that's going to probably remain vacant beyond that 2-year period, and ultimately bring down the sort of presence of the place and come along with those negative effects that I was just sort of talking about. So what drives commercial vacancy? Well, I kind of alluded to a couple of things, but really you've got to be quite forensic with what's driving it within different premises and different areas. Rent is unaffordable is obviously a key one, but we also see things like lease terms, so unflexible lease terms, or shops that maybe have a lease that's simply too short to be able to let efficiently to people. You might have positional things whereby a district centre is quite close to a major sort of shopping centre. So, for example, there might be a local parade of shops that's quite near Brixton Town Centre, for example, and they simply may not get the demand. Or positionally, in terms of the way people travel around the city, you may just not get the footfall as well. Those can really contribute to why shops remain vacant. There may be real damages within the shop. For example, Helena alluded to the shop on Norwood High Road that they've sort of made a focal point, and it's in a really bad condition. Landlords who may not be able to achieve high levels of rent may be really, really unwilling to invest sort of capital into the shops to bring them back to a leasable standard, and frankly may just be happier for them to sit vacant. So another sort of element is around absent landlords. Certainly within Croydon, there are shops that are along some of our key high streets that we simply cannot get in touch with the landlords or find it very, very difficult, and that can be a really, really persistently challenging problem as well. There can be landlords equally who have no real desire to let the shops commercially. They may be trying to turn the shops into residential through permitted development rights. And they simply may be playing a bit of a waiting game before they think that actually that's going to be feasible through the planning system. And so they simply, in that period of time, aren't interested in tying themselves to a lease and want the premises to remain flexible so they can essentially flip it to residential. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of quite a range of different things, but I think it's really, really important to understand what's driving vacancies within each and every sort of vacant unit within a space that you're looking at from a regeneration point of view. So just having a look at the exact area that we're sort of having as a focus right here. So we're talking about the high street, which if you look at the map on the left is sort of the bit that I've circled with a sort of red a red oval. So it sort of stretches from the church at the sort of split in the road, and that bit is called the High Street, whereas the other fork is called Knights Hill. This area, if we look up at the little circle, just sort of in the middle of your page, that's a deprivation map of Lambeth. And what that shows is that actually the area along the High Street has some of the highest deprivation within the borough. What's also interesting about this area is that whereas other areas within Lambeth that were rated as quite high levels of deprivation in the previous indices, which was 2015, have actually improved significantly. They've reduced their level of deprivation quite significantly, whereas this area of West Norwood has remained quite persistently deprived and hasn't sort of improved at the rate of other areas within Lambeth. Which certainly creates a case for putting more focus into this area. And as you can see, it's not the whole of West Norwood. As we start to get down further towards Tulse Hill, we can see areas that aren't as deprived. But we see as we go up this sort of bit of the high street within that sort of yellow circle, all those dark blue areas indicate quite serious levels of deprivation, even compared to the national picture. Compounding this and probably contributing to it is the really high level of shop vacancies within the area. Anyone who's walked up the high street will be able to feel this immediately. There's a lot of low productive sort of activity going on within certain shops, and you're not quite sure whether it's open or not. And there's a lot of really, really obvious vacancies as well. And in a document that was co-produced with a range of consultants and Lambeth Council in 2017 called West Norwood and Tulse Hill, a manual for delivery, this area was shown to have really, really high levels of vacancy compared to nearly anywhere else within Lambeth, if not even comparing to the rest of London. I think it was somewhere like 35% or 32%, which is really, really, really high, even when we compare it to other areas that are quite high levels of deprivation within the borough, as I said. But the map on the right is taken from the revised local plan 2020, which Lambeth are currently working towards publishing. And as we can see, there is sort of a designation of this area as a creative business cluster. And I think this is positive news, and it's Lambeth trying to engage with this area as somewhere that has quite unique characteristics and unique potential. But it should be known that in formal planning terms, this isn't sort of a distinctive sort of actual term. Doesn't formally mean anything, but I think it is a positive step from Lambeth Council focusing on this area and actually indicating that they are aware that this has the potential for quite a bespoke maybe approach in this sort of place. But basically, this is the area we're really sort of focusing on for the rest of the presentation. So this was taken from that document called the Manual for Delivery. And what I think is quite interesting, and I think how the local plan has responded, is that this was looking at the whole of West Norwood right down to Tulse Hill, and has identified this strip within sort of yellow that we're principally focusing on this talk as an area with an opportunity to try and attract small business and creative enterprise to try and drive regeneration in that area. Try and attract more people to live in it, hopefully combating some of the high levels of deprivation, and create more of a resilient place that people actually want to visit. So yeah, that was interesting to see, and I think that has come across quite clearly in the local plan revision. It obviously sits alongside the KEBA, which is quite important for sort of other things that we talked about in this series. So what is meanwhile? It's obviously a bit of an elusive term if you've never heard it before, but essentially it's an activity within a defined space, often left empty or vacant, that is inherently temporary, occurring in a time between two more permanent uses. I think this can have sort of two main functions. This can be within sort of what's called a public realm function. So say you have a bit of a pavement or a sort of disused forecourt somewhere. That would be about a sort of temporary use within that space to try and make it more attractive and try and improve it essentially before potentially something more permanent comes along. But the way that we're going to focus on it within the rest of the presentation is more within the context of a shop unit or a sort of building unit. So you can have it within the domestic sphere, so that's sort of residential, and that can be in the form of guardianships, sort of guardianship properties, or squats within the sort of more grey market area. But again, you know, becoming more focused. It will be within the non-domestic sphere that we're sort of looking at within this context. So that's looking at essentially sort of what do we do with vacant shop units, more or less. It's not necessarily a short-term thing. I think a lot of people think about meanwhile as something you do within 6 months, but it can go on for quite a long time. And one of the goals of meanwhile can be to essentially place somebody within a shop unit that then develops and manages to make something more permanent out of that arrangement. We'll go on to have a look at some of it. Some examples. There are currently estimated 51 active sites covering around 188 square meters of space. So that's 51 active meanwhile sites throughout the whole of the city. That was in 2018. It's no doubt grown somewhat since then. And I think meanwhile use can be seen as beneficial and attractive from a local authority point of view, because it can be an efficient use of space that's being underused, can provide affordability to groups that otherwise would be priced out of certain areas. It can have a multiplier effect. For example, if there's a very sort of underused vacant premises, that's not going to be providing any extra benefit or value added to things that are adjacent to that. Whereas if you can put something, a productive use within a space, you're creating economic conditions that can have what we call multiplier effects. So more business going on there, naturally that sort of trickles down to other business in the area. And it can create flexible spaces as well, which can be really important from a regeneration point of view, looking at short, medium and long-term sort of ambitions for areas. Yeah, here we go. So this is something produced by Centre of London report called Meanwhile in London. And I really, really liked it. It just provides a bit of a matrix about all the different types of meanwhile activity. Now, bear in mind, this takes into account the sort of interim housing and property guardianship, which is more the domestic side of things. But we can see that there is different sort of uses depending on the duration. So how long you want to see this meanwhile use to be put into practice, from the sort of short term to the long term, and also the land availability. How permanent is it, and or how sort of fleeting and interim is it? And as you can see on the sort of right bottom, that's a classic development model. If you've got long-term land and a permanent use is fine, then we're probably just going to develop it in something permanent. But on the sort of opposite space, if we've got quite interim land availability and a short-term sort of experimental approach, that's how we sort of have some of the sort of more innovative, really short-term uses within Meanwhile. One of those is Croydon Artstor, which we'll come on to later as a bit of a case study of what we've done in Croydon. So what's the benefits to a local authority through sort of encouraging a sort of Meanwhile approach within the borough? Well, as I alluded to earlier, obviously where we have a sort of vicious cycle brought on by vacancies which drag down an area and sort of propel that sort of process to see more vacancies in an area, which in all truth has probably happened to some extent along Norwood High Road. Demand to visit that place drops, and basically a benefit from a local authority point of view is you can essentially stop that cycle and try and put it into reverse. It can also ensure that offers of physical space along a high street are retained, especially for groups who still are maybe uncomfortable with commerce in the digital space, thinking particularly about those who are maybe socially isolated or those who are maybe older. Really do benefit from having a sort of physical presence, and this can be a real benefit to actually adopting Meanwhile to create physical spaces along the high road. Opportunities for reactivation in terms of taxable revenue. As you may or may not be aware, local authorities are increasingly funded from what's called business rates, which is essentially tax on businesses along the high roads. You may have also heard that online businesses are quite effective at not paying levels of business rates, which is putting real cost pressures on the ability for local authorities to remain financially sustainable. And so Meanwhile uses, particularly those that can turn into permanent uses, can help deliver taxable revenue and ultimately help to deliver services from local authorities' point of view. And also maybe on that final point, which I think touches upon the project that a small studio have been looking at, it creates that sort of opportunity for sort of innovative, protected spaces that can promote diversity of offerings in the local community. This can be particularly important where a neighbourhood is experiencing quite rapid gentrification, and that is rapidly pricing out spaces that can be opportunities for innovative sort of delivery of different activities, and can be really, really important, that, particularly, as I said, in neighbourhoods experiencing rapid price rises. But of course, I wanted to touch upon why some of this stuff is challenging for a local authority. I think, there are massive benefits to it, but at the moment, as you'll see, there is unbelievable financial pressure on all local authorities up and down the country. Seeing a number of local authorities literally somewhat on the edge of sort of remaining financially solvent as a result of less ability to take in money, and also the extra expenditure they're sort of spending on COVID-related activities. So first and foremost is just available funding to do this stuff. That is going to be key. And it also should stick in the minds of community groups that if they can try and leverage funding from other places, perhaps sort of external grants, that can really help the local authority come to the table by doing what's called match funding, rather than simply looking towards the local authority to fund the whole thing. Another thing which is important to understand is this difference between capital and revenue. And I've got quite a helpful little picture on the right-hand side. Revenue funding is essentially what local authorities use for their sort of day-to-day. So if I was funding my children's services or my adult services or homelessness, that's all done through revenue funding. And even keeping staff within libraries, for example, and running the office building is all revenue funding. Capital funding is funding that we use to essentially either build new assets or enhance assets. And there are very strict rules around using any capital related funding for revenue-based activities. Now, there are a lot of sort of legalistic stuff around it, but that distinction is quite important and does really shape how local authorities can actually sort of engage with regeneration activities within a high street. Very importantly, at this current context, it's important to bear in mind that local authorities probably have access, far more access to capital funding, because they can borrow and then pay it back over a long time, than they do to revenue funding, which is always very, very tight within the current sort of contemporary period of coming out of austerity. Definitions of a high street in planning terms can also be quite an important one. As we've seen, the local plan is moving towards classing the area of West Norwood High Street as a sort of creative zone, but that doesn't, formally have a planning definition. And these definitions can be really, really important. So some of them are international centres, metropolitan centres. Your international centre might be like Oxford Street. Your metropolitan centre might be like Croydon Town Centre. Your town centre is probably more likely to be something like, Brixton or even the main bit of West Norwood. Your district centre will be even smaller than that, and local parades will probably just be small collections of shops, sometimes isolated from other places. Now, these classifications have important implications with regards to how they're treated in a regulatory sense, in terms of the availability of government funding, external funding, and in terms of interventions that sort of government will sanction through sort of the planning scheme as well. It's also important to understand that high streets themselves don't currently have a definition. And so they tend to get defined within the context of those sort of five or six categories that I've just listed below, which obviously has important just is important in relation to some of the things I've said. Another one which I think is very true is that local authorities are quite risk averse, and they suffer from sort of path dependency. So they say what's worked before, we'll carry on with that. And you really have to put a good case together to make a local authority change its course or take a risk, as it were. And I think that's changing. I think local authorities are trying to become more dynamic. I think they're having to become more dynamic based on sort of funding pressures and the way they're interacting with communities. But ultimately, that risk aversion is still very much there within how they choose to intervene within spaces. There are also important implications around state aid, which is still sort of related to the EU, and we'll see how that sort of comes out when we leave. But that's in relation to not being seen to give too many, subsidies to an individual thing within a private market. And public sector procurement rules. Any of our sort of architect friends who've ever bid for anything from a local authority will understand how bureaucratic these things can be, in pure honesty. And that does really tie the hand sometimes in how local authorities can actually intervene within a certain space, and can make it very difficult to allow small to medium enterprise to sort of bid for stuff. And that is something that we do, if we're honest about ourselves, need to really, really look at more critically as local authorities collectively in this country. So this is more just a look at what does the current context for me mean in terms of actually bringing out some of the opportunities for this kind of work. The first is sort of some surveys looking at who's working from home. And as I think it's been identified over this sort of London Architecture Festival series, there's obviously been a massive increase in people working from home. But the real sort of sentiment from people is that this is going to continue. This is going to be a sort of long-term shift towards more people working from home. And what sort of opportunities did that create in terms of creating demand within sort of places like West Norwood that can actually help sustain high streets in a more sort of resilient, sustainable manner? The second one is business rates, as I touched upon. As we're shifting less away from getting government grant for local authorities and more towards being sustained on business tax, essentially, it's going to become more imperative not to have high streets or local centres full of vacant properties to ensure that there's sustainable sort of funding settlement for the local authority. Now, that creates in itself a financial incentive to look into this sort of stuff. I'd just like to touch upon sort of some of the really rapid built environment interventions we've seen in terms of cycle lanes and blocking off sort of streets for sort of low traffic neighbourhoods, and how quickly some of this stuff is coming to the fore within this context, which does show that there is the opportunity, particularly within this time, to move rapidly and look at different models of how we could intervene within places. Retail, obviously, as we know, footfall suffers largest ever decline. So if we thought some of the declines that we've seen over the last 5 years were extreme, based on this and what kind of recovery, whether it's a V-shaped or a U-shaped recovery, we could see really, really sustained acute issues within demand along high streets. And how a local authority is going to respond to that is a key question. This rather strange image was the best I could find about pubs being able to do a temporary shift to be able to do takeaway pints. Now, that may seem slightly offbeat, but what it's sort of alluding to is that there's been a change in planning regulations that allow, within this context, temporary changes of use for venues so that they can do different functions within planning legislation. Now, within this context, it's allowed hospitality sector to do sort of takeaway options. But I'd like to sort of say it does open the door to think about how more flexible change of use in a sort of temporary context, even potentially localized to certain areas, could be developed going forward. And it's certainly something we're looking at in Croydon. And finally, the Greater London Authority, one of the major places the local authorities get external grant funding, certainly for Croydon, has been willing to be more flexible in terms of both committed grants and future grants, and how those can be repurposed maybe from their original sort of original scope to be more based around high street recovery. And that's a really, really important point in terms of how local authorities, particularly in this sort of real tight funding context, are going to be able to actually accumulate money to do some of these regeneration interventions. So finally, we get on to Croydon Artstor, which is my sort of first case study of what we've been doing in Croydon. This is a sort of four shop space. I know it says 4-storey, but it's sort of 2 units on 2 floors. Within the Whitgift Centre. Now, if anyone knows the Whitgift Centre, it's on North End Road, which is right in the centre of sort of the shopping district in central Croydon. And for anyone who's ever followed anything in Croydon, it is supposedly going to be demolished to make way for Westfields, which has been sort of on the cards for a long period of time. We've been massive negotiations with Westfield, but essentially what it means is that demand to re-let spaces within the Whitgift Centre has been quite low because many shops don't think it's worth the risk of re-letting and then having to stop very quickly because Westfield finally does go ahead. So that's created a high vacancy context within the shopping centre. And what we did within this space was use some money from a fund we put together, which was half Croydon Council capital funding and half from the GLA, together with a funding source from what's called the growth zone area, which very, very simply is basically us being able to borrow more money than we usually would from government on the idea of massively regenerating Croydon Town Centre, and then the fact that we'll have more business rate money in the future. So we put those 2 funds together, and we worked with the Whitgift freeholder to turn this space into a sort of multi-use space that mainly focused on creative and artistic uses. It has free bookable space for young creatives and is strongly tied in with the sort of youth engagement priorities for the council. It's essentially operated through a partnership foundation with Croydon Council, Turf Projects, which is a Croydon-based artist-run contemporary art space that hosts free exhibitions, workshops and events. Kingston School of Art do a lot of sort of activities within this space as well, and deliver sort of workshops and learning events and do research out of it. And Art Halo, which is a sort of charity-based organisation that works towards the vision of making high-quality art activity available to all. Interestingly, from the council's perspective, as well as being able to facilitate these amazing uses, which have so many benefits for the local area, we've also managed to run workshops out of it that allow us to deliver sort of community engagement within the heart of Croydon Town Centre. So, for example, within our local plan review, we hosted a physical space known as an urban room within that sort of top right bit called CAS, which was really, really well received, and I think brought what can be quite a dry subject in terms of like the local plan review really to life and got a much wider range of audiences. So it can also be a flexible space for the council to look at a localities approach as well. And essentially this was possible because of a really strong working relationship with the freeholder of the Whitgift Centre. And it's an important point that having strong relationships with landowners and freeholders is absolutely essential to do some of this stuff, particularly at scale. The sort of second, this is it. So the sort of second case that I want to look at is more on a localized basis. So this is our commercial empty property strategy. So this is focused specifically on A1 to A5 shopping units, which for anyone not too familiar with planning legislation is related to basically your normal shop fronts that do sort of different types of retail and different types of commercial uses. And it's looking at shopping parades, town centres, district centres, And our focus is sort of spatially targeted on places that we've identified with high vacancy rates, as captured by Croydon's annual monitoring report, which is sort of a planning database. It's founded upon working directly with landlords who have long-term, i.e. Longer than 6 months, but more focused on those with longer than 2-year landlords, via estate agents or working through the land registry to sort of directly contact them. It's a prioritisation schema for intervention based on the following factors. How long has the unit been vacant? Where it's its location? Can we find prospective tenants? Really, really important. How much of an effort and cost is it going to be to do something with these units? And timescales from how quickly we could turn a void into a tenanted property. So there's a number of different interventions we can sort of take, and remembering back to those reasons that a shop was vacant back in sort of earlier in the presentation, that really does focus how we sort of engage with landowners and what sort of policies we look to enact within interventions. So one of the sort of, at the very end of the scale, if the unit is in real dilapidation, causing sort of a danger to the area, and it's just really, really unacceptable in terms of its state, we can use compulsory purchase orders to buy it out, or we can force a sale, but this is rare. The more sort of typical approach is that we work with landowners, and we offer, again, bring it back to that sort of capital revenue side of things. We mainly look to try and offer free build out using capital money to try and fit out the shop to a certain purpose, and in exchange we try and negotiate low rent periods or free rent periods from the landowner. So they get something and we get something in turn. And then we're trying to match prospective tenants to those shops to go on a meanwhile basis to see if they can make a business sort of viable at a sort of low rent, and usually low business rate sort of context, hopefully with the ability to sort of build them up to be able to have a more sort of permanent lasting fixture within that shop that then also provides the landlord with sort of revenue going forward. And at the moment, we're mainly targeting it within South Norwood, Crystal Palace, and around the area of Broad Green, which is sort of the west of Thornton Heath. I'm happy to answer more questions on that going forward. So in terms of our lobbying activity and sort of what we're doing in-house, I've sort of listed some stuff. Something that we think is absolutely critical, and we've lobbied the Secretary of State quite hard on, is to have a usable database of vacancies. If anyone's tried to find out specific vacancy data at a really sort of timely function, a really sort of like, live sort of, what was it last month, it's really, really challenging, and often actually just requires people going out with clipboards. We're currently facing this now within Croydon, and we think it's absolutely essential that the government move towards having a more usable vacancy database that can really help drive local intervention without the need for sort of expensive on-the-ground surveys from local authorities, and obviously community groups as well. Another thing that we think is absolutely essential is the government to try and create a revenue pot. Again, talking about that capital revenue, we can do the sort of fit out and then rent-free things for capital funding. But what would be more desirable from the council's point of view is to actually just fund the shop a little bit ourselves for a revenue period, and then see if we can get a sort of community group to go in. It would be a quicker way to do it. More landlords would probably be happier because you're paying them a direct revenue. And it would just be a sort of quicker, more efficient way for us to be able to deliver these sort of interventions. Now, unfortunately, as I said, revenue is really, really tight within all local authorities. And simply put, that is not going to be a big enough priority for us to use our really, really scarce revenue funding to do. So we would like to see sort of central government actually create a revenue fund for this. Thinking about what we're doing in-house as the council, we're currently exploring how that sort of temporary change of use legislation, remember talking about the sort of takeaway element from hospitality places, could be extended and changed and innovative past the COVID-19 restrictions. I think we've seen in this time of crisis that the planning authorities have actually been really quick, dynamic, and delivered this quite efficiently. So what's to say that this couldn't branch out and we could see, different sort of temporary changes within specific spaces? Obviously, that's going to have to be worked very closely with the planning inspectorate and central government, but I think there is the possibility there. Extending the use of Article 4 directives. Now, this is a little bit technical, but basically permitted development rights, for those of you who aren't so up to date with sort of planning legislation, essentially allows changes in sort of buildings and built spaces, without requiring planning permission. And one of the key ways that this expresses itself is in commercial to residential and office to residential conversions without getting planning permission. It results, in my humble opinion, in some of the worst sort of development coming forward in terms of no affordable housing, tiny space standards. But in terms of the high street, what can be seen is less office, but more commercial to residential, which again, in my opinion, delivers pretty terrible places to live. You know, many of these shops were never designed to act as residential. And without the need to apply for planning permission to do it, it can result in essentially what can be substandard residential homes. Now, an Article 4 directive allows local authorities to sort of block the use of permitted development rights within certain spaces within their borough. It's very hard to do it over the whole borough, but you can try and specify it within a specific area. In Croydon, which has seen more permitted development than any other borough in London, has specifically been developing an Article 4 directive for its metropolitan town centre, essentially Croydon town centre. And one of the final things that we're doing, and is absolutely critical to doing these kind of interventions, is proactively identifying groups seeking these workspaces. I think what's really important when we're looking at sort of trying to regenerate certain places is that we're sort of working in the sort of reverse order of actually trying to identify groups and really working with them critically so that they can come with a sort of business plan to say, okay, if we gave you the shop for a year on low rent, how are you going to turn that into a permanent solution? What's going to happen in year 2 when you've suddenly got to pay nearly full rent and full business rates? How are you going to make it commercially viable? And it's really getting groups that are actually ready, willing, and actually have the sort of expertise to actually go and do that, rather than seeking to change shop fronts first and then sort of just look for groups after. Really, really critical point, that one. But I do also want to touch on very near the end now about Meanwhile within Lambeth. It's really not like this borough doesn't do it, and is actually one of the leaders, I would say, within London. This is Pop Brixton. Most people who've lived in and around the borough will know it. It's sort of an event space near in Brixton Town Centre, and that's an example of Meanwhile sort of within a space where they've done sort of semi-temporary sort of built environment intervention to deliver a sort of you know, essentially it's sort of event space which has multiple uses, lots of commercial premises in there. And it's quite like Box Park, if anyone's sort of been to that as well, which we've got one in Croydon and one in Shoreditch and various other places. That's one expression of Meanwhile. But probably the one I'm more interested in is this really close collaboration with the sort of community interest company called Meanwhile. And Lambeth have got really strong engagement with this company. And they've sort of helped Lambeth develop a number of spaces which are looking at Meanwhile, which look at a number of different uses, such as creative and art spaces, co-working spaces. So that one on the bottom right, I think, is within the sort of town hall. That sort of middle one was in Waterloo, which I don't think is still doing its sort of Meanwhile function, but was quite successful when it was there. And the one on the left is LJ Works, which is a major Meanwhile development happening in Loughborough Junction, which is currently in development. So I really don't want to say that Lambeth isn't doing anything within this space, but actually the way that it's delivering it, at least from what I can see, is mainly partnering with this company, Meanwhile CIC, and looking at sort of areas that it is the predominant landowner already, and potentially not engaging as much with trying to facilitate Meanwhile within privately sort of owned spaces, which I guess is at least something we've been doing maybe a little bit more within Croydon. So this is simply my, and this is the final slide, my approach to how regeneration and Meanwhile might be delivered along the West Norwood High Street area. So again, as I said, investigation in Article 4 to try and prohibit permitted development. Permitted development, in my opinion, is already taking quite a toll on the area. You can see a number of, in my opinion, poorly fitted out sort of residential things that we converted from shops that simply, in my opinion, wouldn't have got permission if they had to go through planning permission. I think Lambeth could look quite closely at trying to push for an Article 4 in this area. I think a detailed investigation of what really critical is driving vacancies in this area. That's going to be a lot of engaging with sort of local landowners, but developing a really robust critical evidence base about why is that shop vacant compared to why is that shop vacant. There'll almost certainly be sort of patterns between those, but there might be individual sort of specificities. And working with the business improvement district in the area is going to be absolutely critical for that purpose. Develop a regeneration framework. So essentially this is a framework which is not too dissimilar from a master plan, but essentially looks at how regeneration can be brought forward in an area where there's lots of opportunities. So thinking about some of the vacant sites within the sort of industrial area, but also along Norwood High Road and in other spaces within sort of the sort of West Norwood neighbourhoods, can really help the regeneration department, working in close collaboration with the planning department, be in sort of close contact with developers looking to develop within the area, with landowners, and it can really help deliver a sort of focus on how regeneration in the area should look. Specifically looking at, what is a development site that's viable now versus what could be within, maybe 5-6 years, and that creates the sort of strategy for where you would focus meanwhile, potentially. I think that point I'll come back to again, which is that sort of grassroots element, is really working with groups and prospective tenants, thinking specifically about their requirements. And so if we could, if the local authority could create meanwhile spaces through vacant shops, who's going to fill it? What's the right group? What the fit out of the shop needs to be? That's going to be absolutely critical and requires a lot of engagement with the local community. Now, something I noticed on the Lambeth Affordable Workspace SPD, which is sort of going to come out with the local plan, which is a fantastic document, and it really shows Lambeth being proactive about this. Interestingly, it's not putting any affordable workspace requirements in terms of Office Section 106 within Norwood. So I think that does sort of create a bigger focus for how affordable workspace is going to need to be delivered in West Norwood if it's not going to come through office developments. And that's something that the Lambeth planning and regeneration team is going to have to think quite critically about. But something that I would be saying to Lambeth, if I could give any advice, would be to try and get local groups to sign up to the affordable workspace register, which is essentially part of how that affordable workspace plan is getting delivered. And that will create a sort of demonstrable, robust, objective demonstration of the demand for affordable workspace within the Norwood area, and actually help Lambeth to create a sort of business case internally to say that we need to be promoting and trying to find interventions to create affordable workspace. Finally, Lambeth have intervened and acquired a quite considerable amount of a site called Site 18, which is by the B&Q. And I'd encourage Lambeth to be bold and look into borrowing capital to facilitate more strategic land purchases in the area, particularly where there are sort of usable sites that they could move forward with now. And once they have it, as we've seen, Lambeth have been really proactive at sort of partnering with Meanwhile CIC to look at how Meanwhile within spaces that they own can come forward. And finally, last but not least, I would say Lambeth don't neglect your legal powers to force remedies within that are causing blights. So that can be forced sale, it can be compulsory sale orders or compulsory purchase orders, because some of the sort of shop elements on Norwood High Road are at such a state that they could quite conceivably be classed as dilapidated to the point that maybe those sort of legal remedies have become suitable. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening.